All right, section E, Wilson battles the bankers. So we're talking about, or we're in the middle of talking about Wilson's New Freedom, and that has three parts. Last video we talked about the first part. We talked about that he wanted to decrease that rate on the tariff. And now we're looking at the second part of his New Freedom, and that is kind of battling the banks or reforming our banking system. All right. So Wilson really felt that our currency and our banking system was antiquated, thinking of the word antique, out of date, doesn't work. So really he focuses on reforming the banking system. And he feels one of the biggest shortcomings is the fact that our currency is so inflexible, meaning that we have just this much currency, and if we run short, we run short. We'll talk about it in a little bit. Anyway, and also the problem was a lot of the currency was really held in big banks in big cities, like places like New York. So in times of panic, it was really hard to get currency to where it needed to be. All right, so this section, I'm going to have to go a little bit back in history to make this clear, which is fine. History of history. Praise the Lord. Okay, so let's see. Talking about the fact that currency was inflexible, meaning that we couldn't issue more or less if we wanted to. It was very inflexible. So remember from last chapter, we see that we have the Ulrich-Vreeland Act passed that allowed the national banks to issue extra currency in times of emergency. And we see this act as really kind of paving the way for bigger and better things. Okay, so going back a little bit in time, remember Hamilton? Remember that guy? He wanted a national bank. Remember, at one time we did have a national bank. That was wonderful. Well, whatever. I don't care. It might have been wonderful. It might not have been wonderful. Nonetheless, it existed. But over time, that went away. So we were left with a lot of individual banks. And remember, at this time, our currency was more or less, you would bring your gold, your silver, your currency or your hard currency into a bank. And in return, the bank would issue you an IOU, or a banknote. And then over time, people started just to exchange the banknotes. Instead of going back to the bank, getting gold every time they wanted to buy a loaf of bread, they just start using these banknotes as a form of currency. So at one time, we had over 15,000 different banknotes from 15,000 different types of banks. So it got to be very confusing because people couldn't tell if they could trust this banknote or not. For example, if there was a rumor that this bank was going to fail, a lot of times merchants would stop accepting that bank's banknotes. And this became a very big problem, obviously. Yes. Okay. Also, there was a problem of regulation. Sometimes banks would issue more banknotes than they actually had reserves to back it up, which would become a problem. A lot of times we see during this time people really like the hard currency. They like gold, they like silver, because that value really doesn't change much over time. And a problem with this currency or these banknotes is a lot of times we would see bank rushes. A bank rush is when people, hearing rumors that the bank is about to fail, they'll rush into the bank with their IOUs, with their banknotes, and demand that they can exchange their banknotes for the hard currency. The problem was that the bank didn't always have the reserves on hand. Sometimes the bank's reserves were in other banks. So they would call in their reserves from other banks, causing a bank shortage, thus a panic at this other bank. Also keep in mind that banks don't just keep money in the safe in the back. They use that money, lend it to people, and make money by gaining interest off of more or less your money, right? That's how banks make money, loaning money at a rate, 5% interest rate, something like that. So people would rush into the banks demanding their money. The banks wouldn't have enough, gold or silver there to supply this demand. And a lot of times what they would then do is they would call in the loans. They loaned $5,000 to Farmer Jebediah to buy some more land. Well, they would call in that loan. They'd say, hey, Farmer Jebediah, guess what? We want our money back tomorrow. Farmer Jebediah is like, I don't have your money. Like, I bought the land. So the bank would be like, tough cookies. So they would take over the farm would go bankrupt. A lot of times the banks couldn't come up with the right amount of funds, so the bank would fail. If the bank would fail, anyone who invested money into the bank or had their money in the bank, they would completely lose their money. Sometimes businesses that had their money in the bank would go, out of business. So it was a big deal. And that's exactly what happened in the Panic of 1907, that panic everyone blamed TR for. So for example, the Panic of 1907, how it ended or what happened was the banks kind of went to J.P. Morgan. Remember J.P. Morgan? He's like the financial guy with interlocking directorates. Remember that guy? Anyway, well, we went to them, or the bankers went to him, and more or less he bailed out the banks. He gave the banks a loan, and then the banks were able to pay the people, the common people. If that makes sense. So J.P. Morgan was kind of acting as a bank to the bankers. Well, Americans are looking at this and thinking, hey, is this really a good thing that we have to turn to these wealthy robber barons to kind of bail out the banks in a time of panic? We know there's going to be more panics. Do we really want to rely on people like J.P. Morgan? A lot of people are saying, no, we need to reform the banking system. And that's exactly what Wilson wants to do. So once again, Wilson goes in person in front of a joint session of Congress, meaning both the Senate and the House of Representatives are there, and he goes and says, hey, appeals to them, hey, we need to reform the banking system, get her done. And that's exactly what Congress does. Congress passes in 1913 a bill called the Federal Reserve Act. I should say an act. Federal Reserve Act, what it did is it created a board. And a board is a group of people, right? So it allowed the president to appoint who's on this board. All right, so the board would be kind of in charge of the new Federal Reserve System. And what the system looked like is they divided the United States into 12 different districts or 12 different areas. And each of those areas had a centralized bank. This is still kind of the way we have it today. So for example, we're in Iowa, right? So Iowa's central bank is actually located in Chicago. We're in the 7th district of the Federal Reserve. So our central bank is in Chicago. Anyway, so they divided it into 12 sections, each section having kind of a centralized bank there. And all of these 12 national banks, or 12 Federal Reserve banks, I should say, are controlled by just one board. And the board is appointed by the president. So we can see the president definitely having control over the Federal Reserve because he gets to choose who's in there. Okay, so kind of this is the idea. The Federal Reserve was supposed to act as a banker's bank. These banks, for example, ours is Chicago. These banks will give loans not directly to people, but these Federal Reserve banks will give loans to banks. So these Federal Reserve banks do not deal with people like me, they deal with individual banks. So banks oftentimes will get loans from the Federal Reserve. And because of this, the Federal Reserve has a lot of power over how our economy runs. Because the Federal Reserve has power over how much interest they charge on the loans they give to the banks. So this is how it works, right? So here's the Federal Reserve Bank, right? The head bank, Bank of Chicago. They get to decide how much they charge for interest on a loan to other banks. So if they charge a low interest rate on a loan, that means individual banks were more likely to get loans. Now that the individual banks have more money, that means they have more money to loan to the people, usually at a lower rate. So that causes people to get loans from the banks, and that causes people to spend money. So if the economy is not really going so hot, if it's really sluggish, we'll see the Federal Reserve lower the interest rate, which causes banks typically to borrow more money, which causes people typically to borrow more money from the banks, kind of increasing are spending. Right? I know this is in depth, but it makes sense, right? All right, so say the other way around, we have a lot of inflation. What the Federal Reserve does is they increase their interest rate. So if they increase their interest rate, that really causes banks to stop borrowing money from them. Because banks stop borrowing money, they stop really giving out a lot of loans. So people now don't have a lot of money to be spending. So kind of slows down the process, especially if there's a high rate of inflation. All right. If you've ever looked at, I have a $5 bill here, woo, Lincoln. If you ever have a second, take a look at some money, right? And you'll notice that on the top of the bill, it actually will say Federal Reserve Note, right? It's right up here. You can't see it, but it says Federal Reserve Note. So when you have money, what it is really it's an IOU from one of these 12 Federal Reserve banks. Okay, we're not on the gold standard anymore. That's for a later chapter. We're backed by Treasury, I can't say the word, securities. But just so you know, Federal Reserve Note, Federal Reserve Bank, Federal Reserve Act of 1913, Wilson's second prong of his new freedom. You are such a beast. You are just an educated fool. I just tell you what. All right. Well, if that doesn't make sense, that's okay. I went way more in depth than you really needed to, but I think it's interesting. Yeah, so Federal Reserve Act is signed. Glorious, glorious. All right, section A, B, C, D. Section F, the president tames the trusts. So this is kind of the third goal of Wilson's presidency. And remember, Wilson came into his presidency with these three goals in mind, and he sets right to work, and he is astoundingly successful in getting the job done. Okay, so the third thing he really focuses on in his new freedom is taming the trusts. He wants to get rid of these trusts. All right, so once again, he goes before a joint session of Congress, and no, it's not getting old. This is still a really big deal to Congress that the president's talking to them directly. Goes before Congress once more and says, hey, we need to start regulating these trusts. These are out of control. So 9 months later, Congress creates something called the Federal Trade Commissions Act of 1914. So Federal Trade Commissions Act allows the president to appoint a commission, group of people, whose job is to investigate industries involved in interstate trade. So interstate trade, obviously that's a lot of industry. So anyway, what they're trying to do is really root out these kind of unfair, unjust practices. For example, false advertising, mislabeling of goods, adulteration of goods, bribery. So this new commission created under the Federal Trade Commissions Act really starts to try to get rid of some of these bad practices that trusts have formed. All right, another really huge, big, remember this, act that's passed during Wilson's tenure is something called the Clayton Antitrust Act. You can recall before we've had something called the Sherman Antitrust Act. Really, the Clayton Antitrust Act is really just an extension of Sherman's Antitrust Act because it includes or adds to the list of objectionable business practices, things like, price discrimination, the idea of interlocking directorates. Interlocking directorates, remember once more, that's J.P. Morgan's idea, where you would have some people serve on the board of directors for a couple of different firms. So the directors or the people who are controlling these companies kind of overlap. Anyway, so they're trying to get rid of that. They think that's bad. Yeah, so the Clayton Antitrust Act, really an extension of the Sherman Antitrust Act, like I said, adding just a few more things to the list of no-nos for business. And another really important thing about the Clayton Antitrust Act is the fact that now it's officially excluding labor unions and agricultural organizations from the list of, let me see, how do I say this? Really excludes them, I should say exempts them from this law. Before, remember, the Sherman antitrust law had really persecuted labor unions, but now the Clayton Antitrust Act kind of gets their act together and says, yes, these do not, exempted from this act are labor unions and agricultural organizations. So our man Sam Gompers, right, the head of the AFL, is just, saying, holy Moses, this is the best thing to happen ever. So this is a really good thing for labor unions. All right. Praise the Lord. Keep going. Wilsonian, section G, Wilsonian progressivism at high tide. So Wilson is on fire. Within the first 18 months of his presidency, he has gone through his checklist. He had his 3 policies in his new freedom, getting rid of lowering the tariff, reforming the banks, reforming or regulating the trust, and he has those done. Boom. He gets things done. But he's not done yet. We see him making more and more progressive reforms. For example, For example, with the farmers, helping out the farmers, he passes 2 different acts, or helps pass 2 different acts. One of them is called the Federal Farm Loan Act, which gave farmers kind of a low-interest federal loan, which was great. So that was the Federal Farm Loan Act, low interest rates for farmers. And another act that benefits farmers is called the Warehouse Act of 1916. And what this does is it gives federal loans to farmers by allowing them to use their crops as collateral on the loan. So when I'm talking about collateral, it usually means if, I get a loan for a car, maybe I'll use this would be a weird example, but maybe I use my house as collateral. So if I default on my loan paying back my car, the bank will then own all of or part of my house. So kind of it backs up the loan in case it falls through. So the Warehouse Act of 1916 does this, but with crops. So a farmer will put in, so much of his crops into a federal storage bin, and then we'll get a loan using that grain or crops, whatever it may be, as collateral. All right. So let's talk about laborers. Wilson passes some progressive acts helping laborers. One of them specifically helps sailors on merchant ships. And this is called the La Follette Seaman Act of 1915. And this act more or less made sure that sailors were treated well. Because oftentimes they weren't. This act made sure that they received a livable wage, which meant, kind of setting a minimum wage a little bit. So, a livable wage, make sure they made enough money to live off of, and also made sure that they were treated well. Kind of the unexpected consequence of this is that it really increases shipping rates. Because, the shippers, the merchants don't want to lose any money, so if they have to pay more money to their sailors, they're just going to increase how much they charge to ship something. Okay, so increases shipping rates, but nonetheless, makes sailors happy, so I'm happy. Okay, another thing that benefits laborers is something called the Working Men's Compensation Act of 1916. And what this is gave federal employees assistance if they were disabled. So we talked about after the triangle shirtwaist fire, company fire, how a lot of states started to pass compensation acts, meaning that if someone was hurt or disabled in an accident, they would have kind of insurance or they would have some assistance. This is the same sort of thing, but for federal employees. If they're hurt, they get some assistance from the government. All right. Other things that were passed, this one was specifically for railroad workers. This is called the Adamson Act of 1916. And like I said, for railroad workers, this was an 8-day workday. And then they got extra pay, 8-hour workday. That's what I meant. It said an 8-hour workday, and they would get extra pay if they worked overtime. So they get pay for overtime. But this would only relate to railroad workers that worked for companies that were interstate, which most railroads were. Praise the Lord. Another big thing he does for the progressive movement is he appoints a big reformer by the name of Louis Brandeis to the Supreme Court. And he's also notable because he's the first Jewish person to ever be appointed to the Supreme Court. But, you know, Wilson, he was from the South. He had grown up in the South. So having that kind of Southern mindset, something that's not super progressive that he does, is he actually segregates blacks within the federal bureaucracy. I can't say words. Bureaucracy. Okay, so he actually does not help out blacks, kind of puts them back a little bit by segregating them within kind of the federal government, you could say. All right. Praise the Lord. All right, section H, new directions in foreign policies. So this is talking about Wilson in regards to foreign policy before World War I. World War I is a whole nother bag of cats. But this is just, you know, it kind of hops around in this section talking about different places he kind of got involved. Something to keep in mind with Wilson, especially when we get to World War I, is Wilson, he hearts peace, right? He's definitely an anti-imperialist, and he's not necessarily an isolationist, but he just wants, you know, he just wants peace. He's not looking to pick a fight. In fact, he hates our friend TR's big stick policy. He thinks that's horrible. He also abhors Taft's dollar diplomacy. He thought that was horrible. So he really steps away from those ideas. Okay, examples, you know, all over the place in this section. For example, he passes the Jones Act of 1916, which promised the Philippines independence as soon as they had a stable government. Of course, he didn't think they would have a stable government for a very long time, but nonetheless, he's anti-imperialist, promising the Philippines through the Jones Act their independence once they got their act together. Other examples, sometimes, you know, although he loves peace, he has to get involved. He has responsibility after all. There's a crisis in California again, and what happens in California is that the state passes a law prohibiting Japanese immigrants from owning land. What's up, California? Can you just give them a break already? No. So they say, hey, Japanese, you can't own land in California. Japan's like, what up, California? Why'd you hate us so much? So Japan, like Tokyo, like the country, is really annoyed once again at California. And it gets really tense, especially because the Philippines, which is now owned by the United States, is right next to Japan. So even, you know, Wilson has the Japanese get ready in case there's a war with Japan. Okay, so this is actually a very tense situation. Yeah, so what Wilson does is he sends our Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, over to California to kind of plead with them to soften their law. And after this, the tensions kind of ceases. But man, we almost went to war with Japan. Thanks a lot, California. Whatever. Also, we see some political turmoil in Haiti. The Haitian people assassinate their president, so there's a lot of chaos. So Wilson sends in Marines to help protect American investment and the American people who live in Haiti, and they end up staying there for about 19 years. All right, Haiti. Another place we see some rioting is in the Dominican Republic, and once again we send in Marines, and this time they stay in there for about 8 years. And just notably, this is the period of time where we actually purchased from the Netherlands the Virgin Islands. The Virgin Islands is a string of islands in the Caribbean, and really we purchased those because they're kind of right along the way when you go to enter the Panama Canal, and we really want to have as much control over the Panama Canal as possible, so we buy the Virgin Islands from the Dutch. Right. All right, last section for this video. This is section I, moralistic diplomacy. Diplomacy, wow. Moralistic diplomacy. Okay, so this all has to do with kind of a hot mess in Mexico. So this is Mexico. It's very special. It gets its own section. Okay, so Mexico has a lot of natural resources, and foreign countries like the United States just love to go in there and exploit the natural resources as much as we possibly can. So we see a whole bunch of United States money flooding into Mexico. We invest in oil, there are railroads, there are mines, that sort of thing. So by 1913, over $1 billion of U.S. money is invested privately into Mexico. So we have a big stake in Mexico. The problem was, while Mexico was rich in resources, that money never found its way to the people of Mexico. So the people of Mexico remained poor as they saw their really corrupt government making a lot of money selling their natural resources. All right, so what did they do? People of Mexico, not liking the corruption in government, kill the president and kind of establish their own president. And his name is Huerta. Starts with an H. Huerta. And President Huerta is actually an Indian, which means he's not of Spanish descent at all. So this is the first president of Mexico we actually see being an Indian. Once again, Victoriano Huerta. That's his name. Okay. So there's a lot of chaos in Mexico, especially after the president's assassinated. So just as a side note, we see a lot of Mexican immigration at this time, and really we start to see this unique culture forming along the border, really a Mexican-American mix, especially because of this chaos. People are immigrating to the United States. In about 30 years, we see about 1 million people really immigrate into the United States. Well, anyway, seeing this new president and seeing this chaos going down in Mexico, a lot of Americans are very scared. They're very protective of that investment they'd made into Mexico. They don't want to see that go away. Notably, William Hearst, yellow journalism, New York City, the guy who owns the paper, had a branch in Mexico that was actually larger than the state of Rhode Island. So William Hearst is being like, hey, we got to do something in Mexico. I have money there. I have land there. I don't want the Mexican government to fall apart. However, what happens is Wilson, remember, he doesn't like to get involved in other people's business. He just doesn't like it. He doesn't want to mess with Mexico. So what he does is he refuses to recognize Huerta as the president. And he places an arms embargo against Mexico, saying we're not going to sell you any arms, any guns. Secretly, however, or maybe not so secretly, we start supplying Huerta's rivals in Mexico with weapons. And Huerta really has two main rivals, and they're very important because we'll see the rivals kind of fighting among each other. One of the rivals, his name was Carranza, and the other was Pancho Villa. Okay, so Carranza, Pancho Villa, rivals of this new president Huerta. Okay, so things are, going okay, but very uneasy. And then finally, what happens is that some United States sailors are arrested in Mexico. I think there's 12 sailors. Let me see this. Yeah, just a small group of U.S. sailors were arrested in Tampico, Mexico in April of 1914. They were soon released, and Mexico apologized, okay? However, we demanded more. We didn't want just an apology. We wanted them to give us a 21-gun salute, which more or less would mean that they had to recognize that, we were superior to them. So we not only wanted an apology, we wanted a 21-gun salute. And Mexico was like, no, we're not going to do that. So now the tensions were really tense. We were thinking, man, we might go to war with Mexico over this. So what happens is kind of his first direct use of military force. Our friend Wilson stops a German ship that was going to supply weapons to Mexico. We stopped that ship from landing. And that is, I don't even know if it really matters that much where it was. Yeah, we don't need to know where it was headed. Anyway, it was headed to Mexico. It's a German ship going to supply them with guns. So we stopped that ship. Okay, and now it's like game on. It's like it was almost inevitable now that we were going to go to war with Mexico. Fortunately for us, the ABC powers step up ABC, Argentina, Brazil, Chile. Okay, they step up and offer to mediate a peace between us. Okay, which was wonderful, especially for Wilson, who hates war. So more or less through this mediation, Huerta loses his powers, so bye-bye Huerta, and we put in place of Huerta one of his rivals, Carranza. Okay, so things are okay, but still very, very much an uneasy peace. Okay, so now we have a problem though in Mexico. Okay, Huerta's gone, we put Carranza in place, but now Pancho Villa is like, what the heck? Like, why didn't I get to become president? So now we see Pancho Villa really becoming the rival of Carranza. So first we had Huerta. After the ABC negotiations, Argentina, Brazil, Chile come in, we kick out Huerta, put in Carranza. So now Pancho Villa wants some power. So his idea is he's going to spark a war between Mexico and the United States, hoping that Carranza would be kicked out of place or kicked out of the presidency, and that Pancho Villa himself would become president. So he's trying to spark a war. So he does a couple of different things. One of the things he does, I'm on the wrong page here. One of the things he does is he kind of pulls aside a train, a U.S. train that's traveling through the northern part of Mexico. And what he does is he takes 16 young American miners off the train and he kills them. Okay, so 16 Americans are now dead. Another thing Pancho Villa does is he goes over the border. He goes into Columbus, New Mexico, and there he kills 19 more Americans. Remember, Pancho Villa, he's trying to spark a war between the U.S. and Mexico, hoping that Carranza will be kicked out and that he would be placed instead. Okay, not super sound tight logic, but nonetheless, that was his idea. Okay, so the U.S. needed to respond. So Wilson sends a guy by the name of General John Pershing, can't pronounce words, into Mexico to break up Pancho Villa's gang, okay, to try to hunt them down. So once American troops go into Mexico, now our American troops are trying to fight Pancho Villa's troops, but also now Carranza starts attacking us because we're kind of like invading his country a little bit. So we almost get Pancho Villa. We get a lot of his men, a lot of his cohort, but finally Wilson recalls Pershing once World War I really got underway. He wanted all of his troops out of Mexico. He didn't want to deal with Mexico anyway. So that's kind of where the section ends. All right. We'll actually start with World War I, kind of that idea, in the next video.